On the occasion of the Inn at Little Washington's and its 30th anniversary, we at Visa are pleased to present this documentary honoring America's culinary pioneers. This is a unique and insightful perspective on 3 decades of this country's extraordinary gastronomic evolution that pays tribute to some of the pioneering visionaries whose talents and contributions have helped to bring our country to the forefront of the international culinary stage. We congratulate Patrick O'Connell and the Inn at Little Washington's on its 30 years of excellence. Their unlikely and colorful American success story is a perfect example of how far we've come as a passionate food nation in a remarkably short period of time. The Inn's future holds delicious promise, and we look forward to being a part of it.
It's gonna be good tonight, Chef.
Well, there used to be the old story that in France it took 3 generations to attain the Michelin third star. The grandfather would buy the property, build the restaurant, and he would have a son who would become a chef. And the son would buy the fine china and the silver and embellish the restaurant. And then he would have a son, and he would send his young son to apprentice at all the greatest restaurants in the country. The young son would come home, marry a beautiful blonde who would work in the dining room, and they would then receive the coveted third star. So America is eternally on a fast track. We have to do things in 1 generation, and it seems as though we have proven that in a 3-decade period of time, we've had to produce a restaurant on a par with what in France might have taken 3 generations.
It's hard to remember now how innocent America seemed in the 1950s. Ike was in the White House, Mamie Eisenhower's hairdo and the space race were the subjects of conversation. Babies were being produced in record numbers as if no one had yet figured out the cause. If anyone had, they certainly weren't talking about it. The country was fueled by a naive optimism. It seemed that anything and everything was within the realm of possibility, except perhaps a really good meal. In the dusty crossroads of Clinton, Maryland, at the O'Connell dinner table, as in millions of other households across the country, luxury was often confused with convenience. Instant was in, homemade was for grandma. Just add water was usually all that the recipe on the back of the box required of the home cook. Out of this landscape of Velveeta cheese and Jell-O molds emerged a man who would be called the Pope of American cuisine. His journey began as a young man when he moved to a farmhouse that, while picturesque, had no heat.
I discovered that a nearby library did have central heat and also had a fabulous collection of old cookbooks, which nobody had ever checked out since the early 50s. I would spend the afternoon in the library storing up the heat and reading these cookbooks.
Patrick discovered Paula Peck's The Art of Fine Baking, a book still considered essential decades after its publication.
I read that Paula Peck set aside every Saturday to make croissant, and each time she made them, she tried to make them better than she'd made them a week prior. And every year, she and her husband would make their pilgrimage to France, and he would make a comparison between the croissants she was making at home and those he found in Paris. And one day, after 9 years, he said hers were so much better at home. That so inspired me that if you were willing to take the time and worked toward mastery, that you could measure your progress and that you could aim high.
Cookbooks were growing in popularity, and authors were growing into personalities, none more pivotal than Julia Child.
Welcome to the French Chef. I'm Julia Child.
We remember her best for her television shows, which taught us that cooking should be enjoyable, even fun. But before that, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, published in 1961, condensed the complex secrets of French cuisine into a form Americans could digest.
Once I had cooked one thing from it, it was really life-changing. It dealt with cooking, A, as an art, and B, with the idea of mastering. That was a completely new concept to Americans at the time. We thought of cooking as something you did once in a while, not in any way worthy of being considered an art, and not something you worked toward mastering.
But it's not going to be one of our better examples of crepes. So I think I'll take it out and say goodbye.
And all along, there was James Beard, campaigning tirelessly for the good, simple flavors of our own country.
James Beard was, of course, for everybody larger than life, a kind of icon, but someone who was proud of all things American and American ingredients, American simplicity, straightforwardness. The turning point for Americans was getting over their insecurity about their own heritage and who we are. You have to remember, it was an era when people still had not tasted Dijon mustard. I remember when Brie came on the scene, the world divided itself neatly into two camps, and those who had tasted Brie and those who hadn't.
Inspired by the books he was reading, Patrick began cooking obsessively, sometimes all night long. But it was the country of France that showed Patrick how he could create a life dedicated to the artistry of gastronomy.
I took a year off and went to Europe and traveled around. Everything changed at that point, in that I was able to see how a different culture than an American one regarded food people, how it was viewed, and I just was astonished at their respect for food, their respect of the culinary profession, and how people would gather around pastry shop windows and put their noses up against the glass and stare at these pastries and marvel. I had the sense for the first time that all of my interests could be combined and that this could be a genuine artistic pursuit, even if the country wasn't quite ready for it.
Patrick returned from his travels to Washington, Virginia, a town of 150 people in a county of only 5,000 people.
Well, I believe in this theory that everyone has a geographical place in the universe where if they find it, everything else will fall into place, their right spot. The reason I believe in it so strongly is I found it.
On January 28, 1978, in what had been a garage with a junkyard next door, the Inn at Little Washington opened its doors to its first guests. The price for dinner was $4.95.
Early on, cars would pull up and they'd park in front of the place, and you'd sort of wait for them to get out, and they wouldn't get out, and everybody would say, "Why aren't they getting out of the car?" Well, they were having their cocktails in Dixie cups. They were very well lubricated before they came in. They didn't miss the fact that we didn't have a liquor license at all. I used to take reservations on a long cord at the stove during the day, and someone said we'd like to come for dinner at 5:30, party of 2, and I hung the phone up and I said, I think this man is a critic. So the person arrived and he ate and he asked to say hello to me. And he said, I've never done this before, but I want to introduce myself. My name is John Rawson and I write for the Evening Star. And he said, I have a question to ask. And that is, do you really want me to write about this place? Because I'm going to say that this place is fantastic. While you might have to get a person just to answer the telephone, and I'm worried for you. He said, I'm just asking, because I don't want to be responsible for ruining your life.
Patrick did indeed need to have someone to answer the phone, because John Rawson was just the first of many reviewers to share the unlikely story of the Inn at Little Washington. New York Times writer and reviewer Mimi Sheridan used her reviews not just for passing judgment, but as an opportunity to educate both readers and chefs about the entire dining experience.
She was a terrifying personage, kind of savage in her criticism. You always felt sorry for the place that she reviewed, but you always learned something by reading her work. I'll never forget that she said, what a diner is purchasing when they go to a restaurant is not a plate of food, but the right to be a part of the living theater, which is that restaurant on any given evening.
Phyllis Richmond began writing for the Washington Post the year the Inn opened. Over her remarkable 23-year tenure, she inspired one of the broadest, most loyal readerships of any reviewer in the country.
She was sort of our worst critic and our biggest cheerleader at the same time, and in her own way helped kind of shape and form and direct through her very judicious reviews. And you dreaded them.
But it was the work of New York Times food editor Craig Claiborne that really brought the Inn to national attention. Craig's journalistic integrity, coupled with his meticulous accuracy, radically redefined and elevated the role of restaurant reviewers and their work.
The first time Craig Claiborne ever came to the restaurant, he said he was riding a little jitney, and someone sat down next to him and they said, Mr. Claiborne, I need to tell you about a restaurant I've discovered in Virginia. And they told him about the Inn at Little Washington, and he had never heard of it. And he said for the next 2 weeks, everywhere he went, he heard somebody speaking about this little place.
Then, life came full circle. Many of the places that had inspired Patrick, the great restaurants of Europe, were members of the esteemed association Relais and Chateau. One day, the then president of the association came to the inn for lunch.
Joe Olivero, a grand personage, an unforgettable character. He said, well, I have to confess that this is the first time that Relais and Chateau has ever received a complaint for a property not being a member. And would you consider being a member of Relais and Chateau? And we said, well, obviously, of course, we'd be thrilled, delighted, and honored. It was early on a kind of completion of that full circle of going to your mentors and then being acknowledged as on their level. Every night, the sophisticated diner would come in and talk about some Michelin-starred restaurant in France that they'd been to. And then one night, all of a sudden, they only wanted to talk about comparable American restaurants. And I thought, whoa, that's a striking departure. They want to talk about the French Laundry, they want to talk about Charlie Trotter's, they want to talk about Daniel Boulud's. They're not talking about restaurants in France anymore. They were responding to the energy that they could sense here.
Across America, people were waking to a culinary revolution. Food and wine were gaining prominence in mainstream culture, energized by entrepreneurs such as Martha Stewart, vintners such as Jess Jackson and Robert Mondavi, wine advocate Robert Parker. And around the country, pioneering chefs were changing the way America understood and appreciated cuisine. In New York, the gastronomic landscape of Manhattan shifted with the opening of Danielle on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Within a single year, it would be rated one of the 10 best restaurants in the world by the International Herald Tribune. Charlie Trotter introduced his highly original cuisine to the American public in Chicago. After a decade of accolades, Wine Spectator named Charlie Trotter's the best restaurant in the world for wine and food in 1998. Alice Waters was inspired by the passion the French felt for their fresh, local, organic ingredients, which became the foundation of her celebrated restaurant in Berkeley, Chez Panisse. And in Napa, in 1994, Thomas Keller opened French Laundry.
It never occurred to me that Michelin would ever enter our country. So when they finally came over here, I was so absolutely elated and proud that Thomas's restaurant was given 3 Michelin stars. It was an enormous victory for chefs everywhere in America and for our entire culture. It was about the acknowledgement on the part of the French that we now had restaurants in America that were unequivocally on par with the greatest in the world. Sometimes people will walk in to the kitchen and say to me, "We've lived in Washington, D.C. for 18 years. We've dreamed about coming, and we've tried to come on several occasions and couldn't make it." Well, their anticipation of this particular experience started 18 years ago, not at the moment they walked through the front door. So it is important for people in our business to realize that this is not a 3-hour experience. It's a lifetime experience.
Through his journey, Patrick has illustrated that the experience of a meal is much more than simply what's on the plate. Rather, it's about being part of the living theater that is the Inn at Little Washington.
I always think of it as a film, and I tend to walk around the restaurant or the kitchen doing this, and now all I have to do in the kitchen is go. And they immediately know, I don't want that in my movie, you know.
Collaborating with London-based artist and set designer Joyce Evans, he has created what some consider to be one of the most distinctive country house hotels in America. Each room is as lush, richly layered, and touched with wit as his cuisine. And now, every suite will be named in honor of one of this country's culinary pioneers.
So I thought, what a simple way that we could assist in making people aware of some of these people who they may never know otherwise or may never fully appreciate. If there's one thing that American chefs brought to grand cuisine and fine dining, it's a sense of fun. A distinctly American spirit of fun and playfulness that wasn't allowed to exist in the classical sort of French culture. No less disciplined, perhaps, but we are allowed to have a good time too. There are no accidents in our profession. I firmly believe that. It is achieved through incredible dedication, sacrifice, and brutal hard work. dish can either be like a lightning bolt that comes to you in a dream and you think, who sent me that? Or it can be a process that takes 6 or 7 years. Fernand Point used to say that it took 7 years to get a dish on the menu from the time that you first began to think about it. The architect Corbusier said that creation is a patient search, and I sort of draw on that sentiment from time to time and realize that it can't be rushed. You can't demand of yourself something because you're just a vehicle. It is really cold in here. It feels so good in here. Okay. Hadn't been given. It's not working. We need a drink. Is there anything to drink? What do you want to talk about? So I will now embark on the story of Campari.